An ordinary pharmacy visit turns into an unforgettable showdown when an elderly woman tells a young black man to go back to Africa. What he says next doesn't just silence the room, it changes everything. The pharmacy was alive with the hum of daily errands. Customers waited in line with their prescriptions, some lost in thought, others chatting quietly. It was a busy Tuesday afternoon in a small neighborhood in Georgia, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone. The autumn air carried the scent of changing leaves through the automatic doors each time they opened, and the fluorescent lights cast their familiar glow over the neat rows of medications and health products. Near the prescription counter, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, stood adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. She had an air of impatience, muttering under her breath as she clutched her small paper medication bag. Her faded floral dress and carefully pinned silver hair gave her an unassuming look, the kind of grandmother you might see at church on Sunday mornings. But what followed was anything but grandmotherly. A young black man, tall and dressed casually in a green polo shirt and pressed khakis, approached the same counter, holding his prescription bottle. His name was Marcus Johnson. He was calm, polite, and seemed to blend effortlessly into the flow of the pharmacy. At 28, he worked as a social worker downtown, helping families navigate difficult times. He was checking his phone while waiting in line, responding to a text from his mother about dinner plans. When it happened, the elderly woman turned sharply, noticing Marcus's presence, and her expression shifted. It wasn't subtle. Her eyes narrowed behind her glasses, and her lips pursed tightly, creating deep lines around her mouth. "You people don't belong here," she said loudly enough for others nearby to hear, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Marcus froze, his fingers hovering over his phone screen. When he looked up, she continued, her tone sharp and cutting like a blade. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The air seemed to thicken with tension. A couple of customers nearby stopped in their tracks, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances while others pretended not to hear, suddenly finding great interest in the labels on nearby products. The rhythm of the pharmacy halted, replaced by an awkward silence that stretched far too long, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of the pharmacist counting pills. Marcus's initial reaction was shock, his dark eyes widening slightly as the words hit him like a physical blow. His brow furrowed, and for a moment it looked like he might say something immediately, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow, measured breath, his broad shoulders rising and falling as his face became unreadable, as though he was weighing every possible response that could follow. The woman, still clutching her small white medication bag with arthritic fingers, stood her ground with the confidence of someone who had never been truly challenged. Her stance was defiant, unapologetic and firm, as though she expected no argument from anyone present. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone within earshot could feel it pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. A young mother with a toddler in her arms quickly steered her child away from the confrontation, whispering quietly for him to stay close. An older man near the vitamin aisle shifted nervously from foot to foot, glancing between Marcus and the woman, waiting to see what would unfold. A teenage girl near the cosmetics section had stopped pretending to read shampoo labels and was now openly staring, her phone held loosely in her hand as if considering whether to record what was happening. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, Marcus stood completely still, his hand gripping his prescription bottle tightly enough that his knuckles were visible beneath his brown skin. The world around him seemed to shrink, every sound in the pharmacy becoming muffled and distant, every face turned in his direction either out of curiosity, concern, or morbid fascination. The weight of the woman's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud that no one could escape, poisoning the previously mundane atmosphere of routine errands and everyday interactions. The elderly woman didn't back down or show any sign of regret. Her stance remained defiant, as though she expected no argument from anyone present. She adjusted her worn leather purse with a huff, her chin lifted high in a way that dared him to respond, dared him to prove her assumptions right by losing his temper or making a scene that would justify her prejudice. A pharmacy technician, a young Hispanic woman in her early 20s wearing scrubs decorated with cartoon characters, had been organizing shelves a few feet away when the confrontation began. She froze mid-motion, a bottle of vitamins still in her hand, unsure whether to step in and defuse the situation or stay out of what was clearly a volatile encounter. The head pharmacist, a middle-aged white man with graying temples, craned his neck around the tall shelves of medications to get a better view of what was happening, his expression showing both concern and uncertainty about how to handle the situation. The growing crowd of witnesses didn't move closer to the confrontation, but they didn't leave either, creating an invisible circle around the two main participants. They were witnesses now, whether they wanted to be or not, and everyone seemed to understand that something significant was about to happen. Some customers fidgeted with their shopping baskets, others checked their phones nervously, but no one was willing to walk away from what was clearly going to be a defining moment. Marcus glanced at the woman with eyes that held depths of thought and experience far beyond his 28 years. His face remained calm, but those who looked closely could see the wheels turning behind his steady gaze. 1,000 different responses raced through his mind in those crucial seconds. He could lash out with justified anger. He could yell and make her feel as small as she was trying to make him feel. Or he could simply storm off and let her ignorance win the day. But none of those options felt right to him. None of them would serve the greater purpose he sensed unfolding before him. The tension pressed down on him like a physical weight, the stares of strangers feeling like spotlights on his skin. But instead of breaking under the pressure, he allowed himself another moment to breathe deeply and center himself. His father had taught him long ago that how you respond in moments like these defines not just who you are, but who you choose to become. He shifted his prescription bottle to his other hand and straightened his posture, his 6'2" frame seeming to grow even larger in the sudden silence that had fallen over the pharmacy. His presence became commanding without being threatening, dignified without being arrogant. When his voice finally came, it cut through the awkward atmosphere like a sword through silk, calm, measured, and deliberately controlled. "Ma'am," he began, his tone carefully measured and respectful despite the circumstances. "Do you even realize what you just said to me?" His question wasn't accusatory or aggressive. Instead, it was reflective, almost philosophical, as though he was genuinely giving her an opportunity to think about her words and perhaps reconsider them. It was the tone of a teacher asking a student to think more deeply about a problem, or a counselor helping someone examine their own behavior. But the elderly woman didn't seem interested in reflection or reconsideration. "I said what I said," she snapped back, her voice rising several decibels and carrying clearly to every corner of the pharmacy. "This is my country, and people like you don't belong here. You should go back where you came from." That was the moment when everything changed. A young woman near the over-the-counter medicine aisle gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. The quiet murmur of shocked whispers began to ripple through the crowd, spreading like wildfire from person to person. Yet Marcus remained steady as a rock in a storm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't take an aggressive step closer, didn't allow his face to show the hurt and anger that anyone would have been justified in feeling. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone present, including himself. He let the pause stretch out, giving her hateful words a chance to settle into the ears and consciousness of everyone around them, allowing the full weight of her bigotry to be absorbed and processed by every witness present. "All right," he said finally, nodding slowly as if he had just made an important decision. His calmness was disarming, almost unsettling in its strength and control. There was something about his composure that made everyone lean in slightly, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Let's talk about that since you brought it up." Marcus shifted his weight deliberately, setting his prescription bottle down on the nearby counter with the kind of careful precision that suggested every movement was intentional. His calmness seemed to create its own gravitational field, pulling everyone in the vicinity closer to the unfolding drama, even those who had been pretending not to listen or trying to mind their own business. He fixed his gaze directly on the elderly woman, not with anger or hatred, but with a kind of quiet determination and dignity that made her shift uncomfortably on her feet. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady and firm but never losing its respectful tone. "But let me tell you something about where I come from, about the roots that connect me to this soil you're standing on." His words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire pharmacy like a blanket. Each syllable was spoken as though it had been carefully chosen, polished, and prepared for exactly this moment. There was something in his delivery that commanded attention, that made even the most distracted customer stop what they were doing and listen. "My great-great-grandfather was born in South Carolina in 1847, he said, pausing just long enough to let the date and location sink into the consciousness of everyone listening. "His name was Samuel Johnson, and he was a sharecropper, working from sunrise to sunset on land he didn't own, breaking his back in cotton fields so that his children might have even the slightest chance at a better life than the one he had been given." The woman's lips tightened into a thin line, but she said nothing, her earlier bravado beginning to waver slightly in the face of his composed response. The crowd, however, was completely transfixed, hanging on every word. A middle-aged man near the pharmacy counter who had been mindlessly scrolling through his phone put the device down entirely, giving Marcus his full attention. An older couple who had been whispering to each other fell silent, though they continued to watch the exchange with fascination. His father before him, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength and resonance as he spoke, was a man named Isaiah Johnson. He was kidnapped from his homeland in West Africa when he was just 16 years old, chained in the hull of a slave ship for 2 months, beaten until he could barely stand, and then sold like a piece of livestock at a market in Charleston. And for what purpose? To help build the very country whose soil you're now telling me I don't belong on. A visible hush fell over the room, deeper and more profound than before. Even the constant hum of the pharmacy's refrigeration units seemed to quiet in respect for the gravity of his words. The elderly woman's face was beginning to show the first signs of uncertainty, though her stubborn pride kept her from backing down completely. "My grandfather, Thomas Johnson," Marcus went on, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its intensity or power, "fought in World War II in the Pacific Theater. He enlisted in 1943, when he was just 19 years old, and spent 3 years fighting for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life and limb for democracy and freedom, only to treat him like a second-class citizen when he returned home with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that lasted the rest of his life." He paused for effect, letting the weight of history settle into the minds of his impromptu audience. He couldn't sit at the same lunch counters as the white soldiers he had served alongside, couldn't drink from the same water fountains, couldn't even use the same restrooms in the country he had bled for. But he stayed. Do you know why? Because he believed in this country's promise of equality and justice for all, even when that promise was broken again and again, even when it didn't seem to believe in him. A profound hush fell over the entire pharmacy, deeper and more meaningful than the previous silence. Even the constant background noise of the building, the hum of fluorescent lights, the soft whir of air conditioning, the distant sounds of traffic outside, seemed to quiet in respectful acknowledgement of the gravity of his words. The elderly woman's weathered face was beginning to show the first visible signs of uncertainty and discomfort, though her stubborn pride and lifetime of ingrained prejudices kept her from backing down completely or admitting she might be wrong. "My grandfather, Thomas Johnson," Marcus continued, his tone softening with genuine affection and respect, but losing none of its intensity or commanding power, "fought in World War II in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese forces. He enlisted voluntarily when he was just 19 years old and could have found ways to avoid military service, and spent 3 long, brutal years fighting island by island for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life and limb for the principles of democracy and freedom, only to treat him like a second-class citizen when he returned home with shrapnel permanently embedded in his left leg and psychological nightmares that haunted him for the rest of his 87 years on this earth." The audience was completely captivated now, some of them unconsciously leaning forward to catch every word. A young college student, who had been waiting for her birth control prescription, found herself wiping away tears she hadn't realized were forming. An elderly black man near the blood pressure monitor nodded slowly, recognition and understanding clear in his eyes, as he undoubtedly remembered similar stories from his own family history. Marcus paused for a long moment, letting the weight of 3 generations of American history settle into the minds and hearts of his impromptu audience. When he continued, his voice carried even more emotion, though it remained perfectly controlled. When he came back from Okinawa in 1946, he couldn't sit at the same lunch counters as the white soldiers he had served alongside, couldn't drink from the same water fountains, couldn't even use the same public restrooms in the very country he had bled and nearly died. He couldn't get a loan to buy a house in certain neighborhoods, couldn't send his children to certain schools, couldn't even get a decent job, despite his military service and the skills he had learned. But you know what he did. He stayed. He stayed, and he fought every single day, not with weapons or violence, but with dignity and perseverance, and an unshakable belief in this country's promise of equality and justice for all, even when that promise was broken again and again, even when it seemed like America didn't believe in him or value his sacrifice. The silence stretched on as people absorbed not just his words but the passion and pain behind them. Several customers had stopped pretending to shop and were now openly listening to what had become an impromptu history lesson and moral awakening. He paused again, allowing the full emotional weight of his family's American story to resonate with everyone present. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow even more powerful. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are, as your children are, as your grandchildren are," he said, shaking his head slowly with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Maybe even more so, because my family didn't just inherit their place here, they earned it through centuries of suffering, sacrifice, and service. They paid the price for their citizenship in blood, sweat, tears, and dignity maintained in the face of unimaginable hardship and injustice." The elderly woman's face had undergone a complete transformation during his speech. The anger and defiance that had initially hardened her features were now replaced by a complex mixture of emotions: embarrassment, confusion, and what appeared to be the first stirrings of genuine shame. Her hands were trembling more noticeably as she clutched her medication bag, and she seemed to be struggling with something internal, some fundamental challenge to beliefs she had held for decades. Marcus took a small step back, his composure remaining completely unshaken, despite the emotional intensity of what he had just shared. His voice, when he addressed the entire crowd of witnesses, carried a tone of gentle but firm instruction, like a teacher concluding an important lesson. "I could have walked away when she first spoke to me," he said, turning slightly to include everyone in the pharmacy in his final remarks. "I could have ignored her words, pretended I didn't hear them, or simply left without saying anything. But what good would that have done? What good does silence do in the face of ignorance and hatred? Prejudice doesn't get better when we refuse to confront it. Racism doesn't disappear when we pretend it isn't there. It's up to all of us, every single person in this room, to be better than this, to demand better than this, and to refuse to accept words and attitudes like the ones you just witnessed." The weight of his final statement lingered in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with meaning and impossible to ignore. The silence after Marcus's words was almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved. The elderly woman's face was a patchwork of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something deeper, something that looked almost like shame. She glanced around the crowd as if searching for an ally, but none came. A middle-aged man with a baseball cap stepped forward. "He's right," the man said, his voice breaking the quiet. "We've got to be better than this." His words seemed to break a spell. An older woman near the cold medicine aisle nodded. "My dad fought in that same war," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs began to grow. A young pharmacy tech, no older than 20, called out from behind the counter, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you." The elderly woman, now visibly flustered, clutched her purse tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. Her voice, when it finally came, was quieter, almost pleading. "I didn't mean," she started, but stopped herself. Marcus turned back to her, his expression softer now. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter, even more. A man from behind the pharmacy counter clapped slowly, breaking the tension. It was hesitant at first, but then others joined in, the sound swelling into something undeniable. People clapped not just for Marcus's words, but for the courage it took to confront hate with dignity. The elderly woman looked around one last time, her face pale, before quietly walking toward the exit. As she walked away, a few people moved to comfort Marcus. One woman placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Marcus smiled faintly, picking up his prescription bottle from the counter. "Sometimes," he said almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing, it's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly dispersed, the tension in the air replaced by a sense of reflection. Some looked inspired, others thoughtful, but everyone seemed changed in some small way. The moment had passed, but the impact of Marcus's words was far from over. As the crowd returned to their routines, the atmosphere in the pharmacy felt different, quieter, more thoughtful. Marcus finished getting his prescription, his steps measured as if he were processing everything that had just happened. The weight of the moment hadn't shaken him, but it had left him reflective. At the checkout counter, the young pharmacy tech who had spoken up earlier processed his medication with a shy smile. "What you said back there," she hesitated, then continued, "it meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace." Marcus smiled back, his tone warm. Sometimes grace is the only way to break through. Anger just builds walls. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Marcus walked to his car, he noticed the elderly woman sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment he thought about walking over to her, but decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle, and he had already said what needed to be said. Later that evening, Marcus sat with his father at the kitchen table, recounting the day's events. His father, a man of few words, listened intently, his hands folded on the table. "You did the right thing, son," his father said finally. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her, she might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes. Plant the seed and let it grow." Marcus nodded, his father's words resonating deeply. He realized that while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it was necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only allows it to fester. Across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. Marcus's words replayed in her mind, each one cutting through the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in, and for the first time, she felt a pang of something unfamiliar, doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the pharmacy spread through the neighborhood. People talked about Marcus's response, his courage, and the dignity with which he handled the situation. It became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what's right. Marcus didn't seek attention for what he'd done, but his actions rippled through the community in ways he hadn't expected. Strangers approached him with gratitude, sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that had long been avoided. The elderly woman, too, began to change. It wasn't immediate, but she started to question the beliefs she had held for so long. She didn't know if she'd ever see Marcus again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean speaking calmly, with conviction, and letting the truth do the rest. To everyone watching, let this be a reminder: your words and actions matter. They can hurt or they can heal. They can divide or they can unite. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together we can spread messages of hope, courage, and understanding to create a better world.